Ikenna stood by the roadside, watching his mother fry akara under the blistering sun. Her hands moved deftly, scooping batter into the sizzling oil, a look of quiet determination on her face. The aroma wafted through the air, drawing a crowd of hungry customers. But all Ikenna felt was shame. His peers walked by in their fine clothes, whispering and pointing. They called him the Akara woman's son, a label that stung deeper than he cared to admit. Though his mother's love was boundless, Ikenna's heart simmered with resentment. His father had abandoned them for a wealthy woman, leaving his mother to scrape by in poverty. Ikenna didn't care about her sacrifices or the way she always found a way to feed him, even if it meant going without herself. All he wanted was to escape this life, to be more than the poor boy from the neighborhood. At 14, Ikenna found solace in the streets, where he ran with a group of older boys known for their wild ways. They introduced him to a world of petty theft, street fights, and late-night escapades. It was dangerous, but it made him feel alive, powerful, even. His mother begged him to stay home, her eyes wet with tears each time he left. "Ikenna, you're all I have," she would plead. But her words fell on deaf ears. To Ikenna, her love felt like chains, anchoring him to a life of struggle and mediocrity. His new friends offered him freedom, excitement, and a taste of rebellion. Little did he know, their influence would lead him down a path darker than he could ever imagine, a path where there would be no turning back. It was a sweltering afternoon when Ikenna collapsed in their tiny apartment. His body burned with fever, his breathing shallow and labored. His mother, Ngozi, rushed to his side, panic gripping her heart as she called out his name. He didn't respond. Without wasting another second, she wrapped him in a thin wrapper and carried him on her back to the nearest hospital. The hospital lobby was crowded with patients, but Ngozi pushed through, desperation etched on her face. "My son is dying," she cried to the nurse at the reception. The nurse glanced at Ikenna, whose limp body spoke volumes, and called for a doctor. Moments later, a doctor arrived, checked Ikenna's vitals, and shook his head gravely. "He needs immediate treatment, but we can't proceed without a deposit of 30,000 naira, the doctor said flatly. Ngozi's heart sank. She didn't have that kind of money. She fell to her knees, pleading, "Please, doctor. I'll pay, I swear. Just save my son's life." But the doctor was firm. "Hospital policy, madam. No deposit, no treatment." Ngozi raced through the streets, knocking on the doors of every neighbor, friend, and acquaintance she could think of. She explained Ikenna's condition, begged for help, and even offered to repay double. But times were hard, and no one had money to spare. Exhausted and out of options, Ngozi made a painful decision. She would go to Ikenna's father in the neighboring town. She hadn't seen him since he left them for his wealthy wife years ago. With no transport money, she walked for hours under the scorching sun, arriving at his grand house with blistered feet. Ikenna's father greeted her with disdain. "What are you doing here?" he demanded. "Our son is dying," Ngozi said, her voice trembling. "I need money for his treatment." But his wife appeared, cold and commanding. "We don't owe you anything. Leave." Ngozi turned back to her ex-husband, her eyes brimming with tears. "Please, for the sake of your blood." He hesitated but ultimately shook his head. "I can't help you." Defeated but undeterred, Ngozi returned to the hospital. She knelt before the administration, sobbing. Finally, the hospital's mortician intervened. "There's a way," he said, "but it's not easy. If you agree to work as a mortuary assistant for a month, cleaning the bodies of the dead, we'll treat your son." Without hesitation, Ngozi agreed. Her son's life was worth any sacrifice. Ngozi's first night in the hospital mortuary was a trial she would never forget. The cold, sterile air reeked of formaldehyde, and the dim fluorescent lights flickered ominously. She stood in the corner, trembling as the mortician handed her gloves and a bucket of cleaning supplies. "This is your workspace," he said, motioning to the rows of lifeless bodies covered in white sheets. "You clean the floors, scrub the tables, and wash the bodies before they're prepared for burial." Ngozi nodded, her throat dry. She reminded herself that this was for Ikenna. Every stroke of the mop and every scrub of the tables was a step closer to saving her son. But when it came time to touch the first body, she froze. "Just think of your boy," the mortician urged, noticing her hesitation. Clenching her teeth, Ngozi forced herself to move. Tears blurred her vision as she worked through the night. The eerie silence was occasionally broken by the faint hum of machines, but nothing could drown out the haunting thoughts in her mind. As days turned into weeks, Ngozi adjusted to the grim routine. She worked long hours in the mortuary, returning home exhausted to check on Ikenna. The doctors had begun treatment, and his condition was slowly improving, though he remained weak and bedridden. Ngozi's neighbors began to whisper about her new job. "She's washing corpses now," they murmured, their voices laced with judgment. But Ngozi ignored them. Pride meant nothing to her when her son's life was at stake. One evening, as she sat by Ikenna's hospital bed, he stirred and opened his eyes. "Mama," he croaked, his voice barely audible. Ngozi's heart swelled with relief. "Yes, my son. I'm here," she whispered, brushing his forehead with trembling hands. She didn't tell him about the mortuary job or the sacrifices she was making. He didn't need to know. All that mattered was that he was alive. Ngozi's new reality was the subject of every corner discussion in their neighborhood. Women at the Akira stand exchanged knowing looks whenever she passed, while children whispered behind her back. "That's the woman who cleans corpses," they would say, their voices barely hushed. Ngozi, however, kept her head high. Each morning, she left for the hospital with resolve in her heart, ignoring the stares and judgment. Her neighbors didn't understand the weight of her decision. They didn't see her son lying in a hospital bed, fighting for his life. Meanwhile, Ikenna's recovery was slow but steady. Though weak, he had started sitting up, and the doctors said he would be discharged soon. Ngozi sat by his bedside every evening, feeding him warm soup and sharing gentle words of encouragement. Yet she always returned to the mortuary, her nights spent scrubbing and cleaning, her body aching from exhaustion. One day, as Ngozi prepared to leave the hospital, she overheard two nurses talking in hushed tones. "She's the one working in the mortuary to pay for her son's treatment," one said, shaking her head in disbelief. "Imagine the strength it takes to do that." Unbeknownst to them, Ikenna had overheard their conversation. Confused and concerned, he called his mother when she returned to his room. "Mama, what are they saying about you?" he asked, his eyes searching hers for answers. Ngozi froze. She had wanted to shield him from the truth, but the moment had come. "It's nothing, my son," she began, but her voice cracked. "I've just been helping out at the hospital to pay for your treatment." "What kind of work?" Ikenna pressed, a hint of fear in his voice. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. "I cleaned the mortuary," she admitted. "It's the only way they would agree to treat you." Ikenna's heart sank. He stared at his mother, the weight of her sacrifice hitting him like a wave. For the first time, he truly understood the depth of her love and the lengths she would go to save him. Ikenna lay silent for hours after his mother's confession, the reality of her sacrifice weighing heavily on his mind. He had always seen her as the hard-working Akira woman, the one who scolded him for staying out late and pushed him to be better. But now, he saw her differently, a mother who faced unimaginable humiliation and fear to save her only son. That night, as Ngozi sat beside him, gently massaging his hands, Ikenna spoke up. "Mama, I'll make it up to you. I promise. One day, you won't have to struggle anymore." Ngozi smiled faintly, her eyes tired but warm. "Ikenna, my son, all I want is for you to grow up healthy and strong. Don't worry about me. Worry about making a good life for yourself, a life of honesty and hard work." Her words pierced Ikenna's heart. He wanted to believe her, but the shame of knowing she worked among the dead because of him refused to let go. He swore silently that he would find a way to repay her, no matter the cost. When Ikenna was finally discharged from the hospital, Ngozi was there to carry him home. She had used her last savings to pay for his medication and food, and their small apartment now seemed emptier than before. Though weak, Ikenna insisted on walking himself into the house. The neighbors watched as he leaned on his mother for support. Some offered kind words, while others murmured among themselves, their voices tinged with disdain. Once inside, Ikenna looked around the room, the cracked walls, the creaky bed, the small pot of akara batter on the stove, and something inside him snapped. He couldn't let this be their reality forever. "I'll take care of us, Mama," he said again, his voice firmer this time. Ngozi chuckled softly, patting his shoulder. "You already do, my son. By just being alive." But Ikenna didn't share her contentment. He was determined to change their circumstances, even if it meant taking risks he didn't yet fully understand. Weeks after Ikenna's recovery, life returned to its harsh routine. Ngozi was back to frying akara by the roadside, earning just enough to keep them afloat. Ikenna spent most of his days at home, restless and brooding. The image of his mother scrubbing corpses in the mortuary haunted him, fueling his determination to break free from the chains of poverty. One afternoon, as Ikenna wandered the neighborhood, he stumbled upon Chukwudi, the wealthy boy everyone envied. Chukwudi leaned against a flashy car, surrounded by friends who hung on his every word. Ikenna hesitated, watching from a distance. He had always felt inferior around boys like Chukwudi, but today, envy overpowered his insecurity. "Hey, Ikenna!" Chukwudi called out, noticing him. "What are you doing here? Come, join us." Ikenna approached cautiously, feeling both drawn and out of place. Chukwudi's friends greeted him warmly, as if they had known him for years. Their easy laughter and casual display of wealth mesmerized him. "You know," Chukwudi began, handing Ikenna a chilled drink, "life doesn't have to be this hard. Look at me. I used to be just like you, struggling, watching my mother scrape by. But I found a way out." Ikenna's curiosity piqued. "How?" he asked, unable to hide the desperation in his voice. Chukwudi smiled knowingly. "It's not something I can explain here. But if you're serious about changing your life, come to a party tomorrow night. You'll meet people who can show you the way." The offer was tantalizing, but it came with an unspoken warning. Ikenna hesitated for a moment before nodding. "I'll be there," he said, sealing his fate with those simple words. The night of the party arrived, and Ikenna stood outside the grand house, his heart pounding. Music blared from within, and the air was thick with the scent of wealth, expensive perfumes, fine drinks, and luxury cars parked in every corner. Chukwudi greeted him at the door, dressed in designer clothes that gleamed under the lights. "Welcome," he said, clapping Ikenna on the back. Inside, Ikenna was overwhelmed by the opulence. Young boys, barely older than him, flaunted wads of cash, gold chains, and the latest gadgets. They moved with confidence, as if the world belonged to them. "You see this?" Chukwudi said, gesturing around the room. "This could be your life. No more struggling, no more shame. But it's not free. You have to be ready to pay the price." "What's the price?" Ikenna asked, his voice trembling with anticipation. Chukwudi's eyes darkened, and he leaned closer. "That depends on how far you're willing to go." The party was a whirlwind of luxury and excess, a world so far removed from Ikenna's life that it felt surreal. He moved through the crowd, watching boys his age toss money into the air as if it were meaningless paper. Chukwudi led him to a corner where a group of older men sat, their eyes sharp and calculating. "This is the one I told you about," Chukwudi said, introducing Ikenna. "He's hungry, just like we were." One of the men, a tall figure with a deep scar across his face, studied Ikenna. "Do you know what you're asking for, boy?" he said, his voice low and menacing. "I want to leave poverty behind," Ikenna replied, his voice steady despite the fear tightening his chest. The man chuckled darkly. Everyone here wanted the same. But wealth comes at a cost. Are you willing to pay it? "I'll do anything," Ikenna said, the desperation in his voice undeniable. The men exchanged knowing glances before the scarred one leaned forward. "There's someone you need to meet. Someone who can give you everything you desire. But once you meet him, there's no turning back. Do you understand?" Ikenna nodded. He had made up his mind. A few nights later, under the cover of darkness, Chukwudi led Ikenna to a remote part of town. The streets were eerily quiet, and the air was thick with tension. They arrived at a secluded hut surrounded by tall trees. Inside, the room was dimly lit by flickering candles. At the center sat Baba, an old man with piercing eyes that seemed to see straight into Ikenna's soul. "You seek wealth," Baba said, his voice like a whisper carried on the wind. "Yes," Ikenna replied, trying to keep his voice steady. Baba smiled, revealing teeth stained yellow with age. "Wealth is easy to give, but it demands loyalty and sacrifice. Are you ready to offer what is most precious to you?" "What do you mean?" Ikenna asked, a flicker of doubt creeping into his mind. Baba's gaze hardened. "The price of your wealth will reveal itself soon. There's no turning back now. The old man handed Ikenna a pouch filled with strange herbs and a talisman. Take these. The journey begins with your first offering. As Ikenna left the hut, the weight of his decision began to settle on him. He wanted wealth, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he had just stepped into a world darker than he had imagined. Ikenna returned home with the pouch Baba had given him, his mind clouded with apprehension and curiosity. The talisman hung heavy around his neck, its cold surface pressing against his chest like a silent reminder of the path he'd chosen. Baba's words echoed in his mind. The price of your wealth will reveal itself soon. 4 days, nothing happened. Ikenna went about his routine, watching his mother work tirelessly and feeling the weight of his decision growing heavier. He began to doubt Baba's promises. Was it all a trick? But one night, as he lay in bed, the talisman began to heat up, burning against his skin. He bolted upright, his room suddenly filled with a strange, otherworldly presence. Ikenna, a voice whispered, cold and disembodied. It is time. He looked around, terrified. Who's there? He demanded. The voice ignored his question. To seal your wealth, you must bring me the first offering. Go to the riverbank at midnight. You will find what you need there. As the voice faded, Ikenna was left trembling. He didn't know what to expect, but curiosity and desperation drove him to obey. At midnight, Ikenna made his way to the riverbank, the talisman glowing faintly against the darkness. The air was thick with an unnatural chill, and the sound of the rushing water seemed louder than usual. There, lying on the ground, was a small black box. His hands shook as he picked it up, the weight of it surprisingly heavy. He opened it to reveal a note written in Baba's handwriting. Bring this to your mother. Do not open it. Ikenna's heart raced. The note made no sense, yet he knew he couldn't disobey. Returning home, he placed the box on the table and stared at it, his mind swirling with questions. What could Baba want with his mother? The talisman began to glow brighter, and the voice returned. This is only the beginning, Ikenna. Wealth will come, but so will sacrifice. Ikenna sat frozen, staring at the box, his chest tight with dread. He didn't realize he was holding his breath until the voice disappeared, leaving him in suffocating silence. The next morning, Ikenna found his mother in the kitchen, preparing her akara for the day's customers. She hummed a familiar tune as she worked, the rhythm of her movements comforting to him. But today, he couldn't shake the nagging sense of unease that had settled in his chest. Mama, he said, his voice uncertain. Ngozi looked up from the stove, a smile spreading across her face. Yes, my son. You look troubled. Is everything okay? Ikenna hesitated, his eyes shifting to the black box on the table. He hadn't told her about the strange events that had been unfolding since meeting Baba. But now, he felt the need to share it, to warn her. I found something last night, he began, his voice low. A box. Baba gave it to me. He said I need to give it to you. Ngozi's face fell as she glanced at the box. The air in the room seemed to grow heavy. She knew her son too well to ignore the look of fear in his eyes. Ikenna, what have you gotten yourself into? I don't know, Mama, he admitted, his voice cracking. I just wanted to get us out of this life. But now, I feel like something's wrong. Like it's too much to handle. Ngozi walked over to the table and picked up the box with trembling hands. She didn't open it, but there was a deep, knowing look in her eyes. Ikenna, no matter what happens, remember this. There is nothing worth losing your soul for. Ikenna stared at her, feeling a lump form in his throat. I'm sorry, Mama. I thought I was doing this for us. For you. Ngozi sighed, placing the box back on the table. You don't need to do anything to prove your love for me. What you need is to trust in the goodness of your heart. There's no shortcut to happiness. Her words struck Ikenna deep, but the pull of wealth was strong. He had seen the life that could be his, the life that had been offered to him so freely. Was it really worth turning his back on his mother's love? Ikenna spent the rest of the day wrestling with his thoughts. His mother's words haunted him, but so did the promise of wealth and power that Baba had dangled in front of him. The life he had dreamed of was now within reach, but the price, his mother's trust, his integrity, was becoming harder to ignore. That night, as he lay in bed, he could feel the talisman burning against his chest again. The voice returned, cold and insistent. Ikenna, you have not given your first offering. The time is now. Take the box to the old shrine by the forest. Your journey begins with this. Ikenna sat up, sweat beading on his forehead. The voice was getting stronger, and with it, the sense that he was slipping further into something dark, something irreversible. But his desires pushed him forward, the temptation of wealth clouding his judgment. He had made a promise to his mother. He would take care of them both. And yet, with each passing day, it became clearer that the path he was on could never bring peace. Despite his fears, he couldn't resist the pull. He grabbed the box and left the house, the night air cold against his skin. The path to the shrine was long and winding, the trees dense and the darkness thick around him. His heart pounded in his chest, each step forward feeling like a step further away from the boy he once was. But the talisman grew warmer the closer he got, urging him onward. When he reached the shrine, a figure cloaked in black stood waiting. It was Baba. "You've made the right choice, Ikenna," Baba said, his voice filled with dark satisfaction. "You've come to fulfill your end of the bargain." Ikenna nodded, his hands trembling as he held out the box. "What do I do now?" he asked. Baba gestured to the altar. "Place it there. And when you do, your wealth will begin to flow. But remember, boy, every choice has its consequences. What you offer tonight will be the beginning of everything." Ikenna swallowed hard, his stomach churning with fear, but he obeyed. As soon as the box touched the altar, the air around him grew heavy, and the talisman around his neck burned like fire. He staggered back, as a dark energy filled the clearing, swirling around him in a whirlwind of shadows. "I have made my choice," he whispered to himself, as the ground beneath him trembled. "There's no turning back now." The world around Ikenna seemed to shift as the shadows swirled, enveloping him in their dark embrace. He gasped, his body trembling with an unnatural energy. The talisman around his neck pulsed with an eerie light, and Baba's voice echoed through the chaos, deep and authoritative. "Your offering has been accepted, Ikenna," Baba said, his tone now almost triumphant. "The power you seek is yours. But with this gift, you must remember, wealth comes at a price, and that price is not always measured in gold." The whirlwind of shadows slowly faded, leaving Ikenna standing alone in the clearing. He felt different, as if the very air around him was charged with power. His heart raced, both with excitement and fear. The weight of what he had done pressed down on him like a heavy stone. He returned home in a daze, the talisman still glowing faintly against his chest. The streets seemed brighter, the sounds sharper. As he stepped into his house, the first thing he noticed was the change. Ngozi was sitting by the fire, staring at him with wide eyes, as though she had known something was different about him. "Ikenna," she said softly, her voice filled with concern. "You're not the same. What did you do?" Ikenna looked at his mother, her face filled with worry and love. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words caught in his throat. The truth seemed too monstrous to say aloud. He had made his choice. He had crossed a line from which there was no return. The wealth he had sought was now within his reach, but at what cost? As he lay in bed that night, the reality of his decision sank in. He could feel the power coursing through his veins, the promise of riches already beginning to materialize. But a deep, gnawing fear took root in his heart. Was this truly what he wanted? Was the wealth worth the sacrifice? But it was too late to turn back now. The consequences were already beginning to unfold. The next morning, Ikenna woke up with an unsettling sense of anticipation. The talisman still burned against his skin, though the sensation was less intense than the night before. His hands shook slightly as he dressed, but there was an unfamiliar weight in his pocket. He hadn't noticed it before, but as he slipped his hand into the fabric, he felt the crinkle of paper, the unmistakable feel of money. His heart raced. Could it be? Ikenna pulled out the stack of bills, his breath catching in his throat. It was a small fortune, far more money than he had ever seen in his life. He sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the notes in his hands. They were crisp and new, their edges untouched by time. The door creaked open, and Ngozi entered the room, her eyes lighting up as she saw the money. "Ikenna, where did you get this?" she asked, her voice trembling with disbelief. "I don't know, Mama," Ikenna said, his voice thick with guilt. "I don't know how it got here." But it's real. We can. But before he could finish his sentence, the money began to burn in his hands, the edges curling and turning black. He dropped the stack in panic, watching as it turned to ash in front of his eyes. Ngozi gasped in horror. What is happening, Ikenna? I don't understand, Mama, Ikenna stammered, his heart pounding. The weight of the power he had called upon was beginning to feel more like a curse than a blessing. As the last of the ashes scattered to the ground, the talisman around his neck grew unbearably hot. He ripped it off, but the mark it left on his skin burned deeply, as if something had seared his very soul. Whatever this is, it's not right, Ngozi said, her voice shaking with fear. You've done something dangerous, Ikenna. Please, tell me the truth. What did you do? Tears welled up in Ikenna's eyes as he dropped to his knees, the guilt consuming him. I wanted a better life, Mama. I wanted us to be free from this struggle. But now, I don't know what I've done. The room felt suffocating, and a voice, cold and familiar, whispered in Ikenna's ear. You made your choice, Ikenna. Now you must face the consequences. The weight of his decision pressed down on him like a mountain. The days that followed were nothing like the life Ikenna had imagined. Instead of luxury and ease, he found himself caught in a whirlwind of strange events that left him feeling trapped and desperate. The promise of wealth seemed to haunt him more than it had ever promised to fulfill him. Ikenna barely slept. Every time he closed his eyes, the burning sensation of the talisman would awaken him, its eerie warmth pulling him back into a waking nightmare. The money that had appeared in his hands was now a distant memory, replaced by the nagging feeling that something was wrong, very wrong. One evening, as he sat alone in his room, a sharp knock on the door startled him. It was Chikwudi, his old friend. Ikenna hadn't seen him since that night at the party, and he wasn't sure whether to feel relief or fear at his arrival. Chikwudi, what are you doing here? Ikenna asked, his voice tight with suspicion. You're in trouble, Ikenna, Chikwudi said, his eyes scanning the room as if he were looking for something. You've crossed a line, haven't you? Baba's gift is not as simple as you think. The price. It's not just about wealth. Ikenna's heart sank. What do you mean? Chikwudi lowered his voice, stepping closer. You were warned. That wealth you think you're owed, it's not the reward. The reward is the power that comes with it. But the price. It's not just about what you give up. It's about what you'll eventually lose. Ikenna stared at him, confusion and fear rising in his chest. What do you mean, lose? What will I lose? Chikwidi's eyes hardened, and his voice dropped to a whisper. Your mother. She's the first one who will pay the price. Ikenna staggered back, the words hitting him like a physical blow. No, I would never. I didn't ask for this. You didn't understand the bargain, Ikenna. Baba's not offering something for nothing. He wants what's closest to you. Your mother's life is part of the deal. Every time you take from him, you're taking away from her. That's the true cost. Ikenna's breath caught in his throat as he looked toward his mother's room, panic rising in his chest. Could Chikwudi be right? Was his mother's life tied to the wealth he had sought? He rushed toward the door, but Chikwudi grabbed his arm. You can't undo it now, Ikenna, he said, his voice filled with sorrow. You made the choice, and now you'll have to live with it. Ikenna pulled away from him, his mind racing. He had to find a way to save his mother, to undo the damage he had done before it was too late. But the question was there still time? Ikenna couldn't sleep that night. Chikwidi's words echoed in his mind, the weight of their meaning settling in like a crushing stone. His mother's life was now tied to his own choices, and he had no idea how to undo the damage he had done. Every part of him screamed that he had to fix it, but deep down, he feared it was already too late. The next morning, he awoke to a sound he had hoped never to hear, the weak coughs of his mother from the other room. Panic gripped him as he rushed to her side. Ngozi was lying in bed, her face pale and her breathing shallow. Mama, what's happening? Ikenna cried out, his voice desperate. Ngozi opened her eyes, the corners of her mouth curling into a weak smile. I'm fine, my son. It's nothing, just a little tiredness, that's all. But Ikenna could see the truth. His mother wasn't fine. Her eyes were dull, and there was a strange, sickly pallor to her skin. Something was terribly wrong. He couldn't shake the feeling that the curse had begun. He had made the first offering, and now his mother was paying the price. "Please, Mama, don't say that," Ikenna pleaded, his voice trembling. "I need to get you to the doctor. We need to do something." But Ngozi shook her head, her weak hand reaching out to touch his. "There's nothing anyone can do, Ikenna. I'm already too far gone." Tears welled up in his eyes, his heart breaking as he watched his mother suffer. The guilt of what he had done consumed him, but he knew he couldn't sit idly by. He had to find a way to break the curse before it was too late. That afternoon, Ikenna returned to the shrine, the talisman burning fiercely against his skin. He had to confront Baba. He had to beg him for mercy, to undo the deal he had struck. When he arrived at the clearing, Baba was waiting, his dark figure standing like a sentinel in the midst of the trees. "I've come to undo this," Ikenna said, his voice filled with desperation. "Take back whatever you've done. Take it from me, and let my mother live." Baba's cold laugh filled the air, sending a chill down Ikenna's spine. "It's not that simple, Ikenna. Once a soul is bound to the curse, it cannot be unbound. You made your choice. The wealth you seek, the power, all of it, came at a price. And now you must pay it." "No," Ikenna shouted, stepping forward. "I won't let her die. I'll do anything. Please." Baba's eyes glinted with amusement. "You already are doing everything. Now, you must learn the true nature of sacrifice." With those words, the world around Ikenna seemed to shift. The wind howled, and the trees trembled as Baba's figure faded into the shadows. The talisman around his neck began to glow brighter, and Ikenna felt the pull of darkness tighten around him. Ikenna's legs trembled as he stood in the shrine, his chest heaving with the weight of despair. Baba's cryptic words echoed in his mind, and he was paralyzed by the truth of them. There was no undoing the deal. No way to take back what he had sacrificed for the power and wealth that now seemed to mock him. As he made his way back to the house, each step felt heavier than the last. His heart pounded in his chest, the fear that he was losing his mother driving him to the brink of madness. When he arrived at home, Ngozi was still in bed, her condition worsening with each passing minute. "Mama," he whispered, kneeling beside her. Her once vibrant face was now drawn and pale, her breathing shallow and ragged. "Ikenna, you've come back," she whispered, her voice weak but filled with warmth. "I knew you would. You always return when I need you most." Tears filled Ikenna's eyes as he held her frail hand in his. "Mama, I'm so sorry. I didn't mean for this to happen. I thought I could fix everything. I thought I could make things better for us." Ngozi smiled faintly, brushing her thumb over his hand. "Ikenna, my dear boy, you've already done so much for me. But I am the one who must protect you, not the other way around. Don't blame yourself for what is happening." "But Ikenna choked on his words. How could he not blame himself? He had brought this curse upon them both, seeking wealth and power at the cost of his mother's life. "You must stop, Ikenna," she said, her voice growing fainter. "You cannot save me by continuing down this path. I love you, and that will never change. But there is nothing more you can do. The price is paid." Ikenna could feel his world crumbling around him. He had failed his mother, the one person who had always been there for him. But as her hand fell limp in his, a fierce resolve filled him. No matter what the cost, he would fight. He couldn't lose her. Not like this. "I will find a way," he whispered, more to himself than to her. "I will fix this, Mama. I won't let you go." In the deepest part of his soul, Ikenna knew that whatever it took, he would pay the ultimate price to save his mother from the curse he had invited into their lives. Ikenna's heart pounded in his chest as he made his way to the shrine. Every step felt like it was leading him deeper into a world he could never escape. His mother's condition had worsened in ways that defied logic, and the curse, he now realized, was the price he had to pay. The darkness that had once seemed so distant now surrounded him. Baba's figure appeared like a shadow in the depths of the shrine, waiting as if he had been expecting this moment all along. "Baba," Ikenna said, his voice trembling with the weight of his decision. "I've come to make the final offering." Baba looked at him with a cold, knowing gaze. "You think the sacrifice of your soul is the solution, Ikenna? You still believe you can bargain with me?" "I've given everything," Ikenna whispered, his voice breaking. "All I ask is for my mother's life. Take whatever you want from me, but let her live." Baba's eyes glinted with cruel amusement. "Your mother's life is already forfeit, Ikenna. You made the deal, and the price has been set." "But Ikenna's throat closed with emotion. "I'll do anything. I'll give up everything. Just save her." A sinister laugh escaped Baba's lips. "You already gave up everything the moment you agreed to the bargain. Your wealth is here, Ikenna, but there is no way to save her now. The curse is complete." Before Ikenna could respond, Baba gestured to the shadows behind him. The air grew cold, and the wind howled as if the very earth had opened to swallow him whole. From the darkness, a figure emerged, Ngozi, his mother, her eyes wide with terror. "No, Mama!" Ikenna cried, running to her, but she was no longer truly there. She was bound, her body limp and pale. Baba's words struck him with the force of a hammer. "Your mother's life is the final payment. Her flesh must be consumed, untainted, uncooked, once a month, to ensure the wealth you crave. If you choose to deny this, you will lose it all. And when the flesh is finished, so will your life be. That is the price for everything you've sought." Ikenna stared at his mother's still form, his heart breaking in two. "No, I won't. I can't." But Baba's voice grew firm. "It is already done, Ikenna. You have no choice. The wealth you seek will come to you, but only if you feed on her once every month. You've already sacrificed her once. Now, you must complete the offering." Tears streamed down Ikenna's face, his soul torn between love and the insatiable hunger for power that had led him here. He fell to his knees, his hand reaching for his mother's cold, lifeless fingers. "Please, Baba, anything but this." Baba turned away, his dark silhouette disappearing into the shadows. "The choice is yours. But remember this: wealth, power, and life come at a cost. There is no turning back." And with that, Ikenna was alone. The wealth he had longed for began to materialize, filling the space around him with a dizzying display of riches, gold, jewels, and luxury beyond measure. But with it came the crushing weight of the curse. As Ikenna stood there, his mother's body still and cold before him, he knew that he had sealed his fate. The price of his desires had been paid. And now, the true test was about to begin. The wealth that Ikenna had craved all his life flooded into his life with terrifying speed. In an instant, he was no longer the poor boy who had begged on the streets. His house was filled with servants, his name now known among the wealthiest in the region. But even as the riches surrounded him, Ikenna felt a gnawing emptiness deep inside. His mother was gone, sacrificed to satisfy the dark deal he had made. And with each passing day, the curse demanded its price. Ikenna could no longer ignore the weight of the promise he had made. Every month, as the full moon rose, he would return to the cold, lifeless body of his mother, his heart heavy with the knowledge of what he must do. The first time he had fed on her uncooked flesh, the pain in his chest had been unbearable, as though his very soul had been torn apart. But with it came the surge of power, the constant flow of wealth that promised to never run dry. It was as though the world itself had bent to his will, offering him everything he had ever dreamed of. But each bite he took came with the crushing weight of the curse, the knowledge that he was one step closer to losing everything: his life, his soul, his humanity. The more he consumed, the more he could feel himself slipping away, becoming less human and more of a monster. As the months passed, Ikenna's mind became consumed by the cycle: the need for wealth, the need for power, and the never-ending hunger that gnawed at his conscience. He would give anything to undo the bargain, but he knew it was impossible. The curse had already bound him to this path, and there was no escape. Ikenna's once proud spirit was now consumed by darkness. The wealth he had sought so desperately no longer held any value to him. It was a hollow victory, one that had cost him everything he had ever loved. And as the months dragged on, Ikenna's fear grew. The flesh was disappearing, bit by bit, each meal marking the inevitable end. He had begun to count the days until it would all be over, knowing that when the last of his mother's flesh was consumed, so too would be his life. But deep down, he could feel her presence, her love still lingering in the air. The very love that had once kept him going now seemed like a distant memory, a reminder of what he had lost. Ikenna had everything he had ever wanted. But in the end, he realized that the cost had been far greater than he could. The first time Ikenna had stood in that room, facing his mother's body, the pain had been unbearable. The reality of his choices crashed down on him. He had asked for power, but in return, he had sacrificed his soul, his love for his mother, and his humanity. It was a betrayal so deep that no amount of wealth could ever fill the hole it had left in his heart. And yet, the cycle continued. Each month, he returned to that cold, unforgiving room, his actions becoming mechanical, his heart growing more distant with every bite he took. The wealth, the fame, the power, it all felt meaningless. It was all a cruel reminder of what he had lost. Ikenna now found himself living in a world of excess, surrounded by riches, but constantly haunted by the dark truth. His mother's body was preserved, and her flesh fed to him, but at what cost? The flesh was disappearing, bit by bit, and as it did, Ikenna could feel the end drawing nearer. Soon, there would be nothing left. And when that day came, he knew that his life would be over, consumed by the very curse that had promised him everything he had ever wanted. But deep within him, the love he had for his mother still lingered, even as it became a distant memory. Her face, her laughter, her love for him, those were the things he could never forget, no matter how much he tried to numb the pain. Ikenna had everything he had ever wanted. But in the end, he realized that the cost had been far greater than he could have ever imagined. The wealth, the power, the fame, they all paled in comparison to the loss of the one person who had ever truly loved him. And now, with the flesh of his mother slowly disappearing, Ikenna understood the truth. The end was inevitable. The days became a blur of excess and emptiness. Ikenna had everything a young man could dream of: wealth beyond measure, a mansion filled with the finest luxuries, and the power to command anything he desired. But none of it mattered. The promise he had made, the deal he had struck in desperation, gnawed at him from the inside. Each month, as the moon reached its peak, Ikenna would find himself in the room, facing the freezer where his mother's body was preserved. It was as if the world had stopped, and the only thing that remained was the inevitable task that awaited him. The first few months had been the hardest, the guilt so overwhelming that it threatened to swallow him whole. But as the months wore on, he grew numb. He could no longer look at the body in the freezer without a hollow ache deep in his chest. His mother's flesh was slowly diminishing, and with each bite, he felt himself becoming less of the man he had once been. He had traded his soul for wealth, and now he could feel it slipping away, piece by piece. But Ikenna could not stop. The wealth he had longed for was his now, and it was constant, flowing into his life like a river that would never run dry. The riches surrounded him, filling every corner of his home, and yet, each luxury only served to remind him of the price he had paid. "Mother," he whispered one night, standing in the cold, empty room. "I'm sorry. I never should have made that deal." The silence of the room pressed against him like a physical weight. The freezer hummed softly, a reminder of the horrors it contained. Ikenna couldn't escape it. There was no going back, no way to undo what he had done. The curse was his to bear, and there was no way out. As the months passed, Ikenna became more and more isolated. His once bright spirit had dimmed, and the hunger for power had been replaced by an all-consuming fear. He knew the end was coming. The flesh of his mother was nearly gone, and when it was finished, his life would be forfeit. And yet, in the quiet moments when he allowed himself to reflect, Ikenna realized that his greatest loss was not the wealth or the power, it was the love he had sacrificed. His mother had loved him unconditionally, given everything for him, and he had repaid her with betrayal. Now, he was paying the price, and there was no escaping the consequences. Ikenna stood by the freezer, his hand pressed against the cold metal. His eyes were heavy with the weight of his choices, and his heart felt like it was being slowly crushed beneath the enormity of the burden he carried. In that moment, Ikenna knew that he could never undo the damage he had caused. The love he had once shared with his mother, the bond they had, was gone. It had been consumed by his greed, his desire for wealth and power. And now, as the flesh of his mother continued to disappear, so too would the last remnants of his humanity. Ikenna had become a shadow of the man he once was. His face, once full of life and ambition, had become gaunt, his eyes hollow and sunken. The weight of the curse hung heavily on him, and each passing day felt like an eternity. The wealth that had once seemed like a dream now felt like a prison, a gilded cage that held him captive. He could no longer look at the lavish mansion, the cars, the fine clothes without feeling sick. They were constant reminders of the deal he had made, the price he had paid for everything he had ever wanted. His mother's body, once whole and full of life, was now reduced to nothing more than a collection of flesh and bone, slowly disappearing with each feeding. Ikenna found himself drawn to the freezer once again, his heart heavy with dread. The flesh was nearly gone. There was so little left, and he could feel it. He was running out of time. The end was approaching, and he knew that when the last of his mother's flesh was consumed, his life would be over. But even as the end drew near, Ikenna could not bring himself to stop. The hunger for power, for wealth, had consumed him entirely. He was no longer the boy who had once begged for scraps. He was a man who had everything, but nothing at all. With trembling hands, he opened the freezer one last time. The body of his mother lay there, her face frozen in eternal stillness. The flesh that remained was pale, almost translucent, and Ikenna could see the end drawing near. He felt the cold rush of guilt sweep over him, but it was quickly replaced by an overwhelming sense of fear. The curse was closing in on him, and he knew there was nothing he could do to stop it. "I'm sorry, Mama," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I never meant for any of this to happen." But his words were empty. There was no undoing the past, no way to reverse the damage he had caused. The curse had claimed him, and now it was time for him to pay the ultimate price. The servants, despite their loyalty and obedience, couldn't help but wonder about the room. It was the only one in the mansion that they were strictly forbidden to enter. For months, they had followed Ikenna's orders, cleaning the grand halls, the lush gardens, and the vast number of rooms with dedication. But the one room, tucked away at the back of the house, was off-limits. Ikenna had made it clear, no one was to enter or disturb that particular room. It was the only part of the mansion that remained untouched by the staff. They had never seen it from the inside, yet its presence lingered in the back of their minds. Some servants had tried to ask about the room, out of curiosity, but they had been met with cold silence or vague answers. Ikenna would often brush off their questions, his eyes distant, as if the very thought of that room disturbed him more than anything else. Yet, there was something undeniably unsettling about the secrecy surrounding it. On more than one occasion, servants had seen Ikenna standing by the door, staring at it as if in a trance. His face, once youthful and full of promise, had become hollow and gaunt. The weight of his actions seemed to take a visible toll on him, and the servants couldn't help but feel a strange unease whenever they passed that forbidden door. "What's in that room, really?" one of the servants asked another, a young woman named Ada, who had been with Ikenna since his rise to wealth. Ada shook her head, glancing nervously toward the door. "I don't know. I've never been inside, and neither have you. But there's something about it. Something that makes me uneasy." "You're not the only one who feels that way," another servant, Chijioke, whispered. "The house used to feel full of life. Now, it feels empty, as if something is missing, or worse, something is hidden." But they never dared to ask Ikenna again. Fear had settled over them, and though the curiosity remained, the unspoken rule about the room stood firm. As time went on, the servants began to notice the strange behavior of their master. He had become a shadow of himself, his once charming demeanor replaced by a hollow emptiness. He rarely spoke to them, and when he did, it was as if he were speaking from a distant place, his eyes never fully meeting theirs. The mansion, once full of life and joy, had become a silent, oppressive place. The day arrived sooner than Ikenna had ever expected. The flesh of his mother, the source of his wealth and power, was nearly gone. There was only a sliver of it left, enough for one final feeding. Ikenna had spent the past few days in a daze, unable to focus on anything other than the inevitable end. He could feel his body weakening, the curse taking its toll on him. His once strong and proud frame had withered, and his energy had been drained. His mind felt clouded, as if the darkness that had overtaken his soul was now consuming his body. That night, Ikenna stood in front of the freezer one last time, staring at the remains of his mother's body. The weight of his actions crashed down on him like a tidal wave. The deal he had made, the choices he had taken, had led him here, to this cold, empty room, surrounded by riches and yet consumed by regret. He opened the freezer and took the final piece of flesh. He could barely bring himself to touch it, but the hunger inside him, the hunger that had driven him to this point, pushed him forward. His hands trembled as he placed the piece in his mouth, his stomach turning with the realization that this was the end. The moment the flesh touched his lips, a sharp, excruciating pain shot through his body. It was as though his very soul was being torn apart, and his heart stopped beating for a split second. He fell to his knees, gasping for air, his vision blurry. The last of his mother's flesh had been consumed, and with it, the last of Ikenna's life force began to fade. His body crumpled to the floor, his breathing shallow and ragged. His once proud form now lay in a heap on the cold ground, surrounded by the wealth and luxury he had desired so desperately. But none of it mattered now. It was all for nothing. The servants, hearing the commotion from outside the door, rushed to the room. But when they tried to enter, the door would not budge. It was as if an invisible force was holding it shut. They pounded on the door, calling his name, but there was no answer. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the door creaked open on its own. They entered the room and found Ikenna's lifeless body lying on the floor. His eyes were wide open, staring at nothing, and his skin had taken on a deathly pallor. The room was eerily silent, the only sound the hum of the freezer in the corner. Ada gasped in horror, looking around the room. It was as if the very air had been drained of life. The freezer door stood ajar, and though the servants dared not look inside, they knew the truth. Ikenna had paid the ultimate price for his greed. He had gained wealth beyond measure, but at the cost of his soul, his humanity, and his mother's love. The flesh was gone, and with it, so was he. The mansion, once filled with life and laughter, now stood as a hollow monument to Ikenna's tragic end. His legacy was one of wealth and darkness, a warning to anyone who dared to seek power at any cost. And as the servants quietly filed out of the room, they couldn't help but feel a strange sense of relief. The curse had claimed Ikenna, and with it, the shadow that had hung over the house was lifted. But in the silence of that dark room, one thing remained undeniable. Ikenna's story was a cautionary tale, one that would never be forgotten.